So, for some context, I'm a guy, and this happened when I was 18. I was planning on moving out of state for college, and I didn't want to pay the ridiculously high price for student housing. So, me and my mom turned to Craigslist for better options. We found a lot of places near the school and for a reasonable price, but one we found would live in infamy for me. We found a place for $500 per month in an area near the school, so we instantly took it. On the day before my school's orientation, me and my parents drove down to the school and rented a hotel room for 2 nights. On the way down, I was texting the guy about the room, to which he gave a description as well as the address to where I would be going. I'd like to note that I was the one that was filtering through the options while my mom sent links for any new openings. After texting back and forth, he asked for me to send a pic of myself right after he sent a pic of himself. I sent him one, but by examining his pic, I began to feel a bit uneasy about it, especially after he failed to respond to any of my texts after the pic was sent, even the one where I asked him what would be a good time for me to check the place out. Later that night, I talked to my dad about it, and we decided to go to the address while my mom was asleep in the hotel. It was then that my suspicions proved to be true, as we were greeted with a trashy-looking trailer home with a white pickup truck parked next to it. Thankfully, it was like 2 in the morning, so he couldn't have seen us. The very next day after orientation, me and my dad explained our findings to Mom, where we decided that my enrollment at the school would be pushed back to the fall semester until I could find a proper place to stay. So from what I could guess, the guy must have thought I was an 18-year-old female looking for a place to move and that I would be checking out the place by myself. So when it was revealed that I was actually a fully grown man, he must have realized his plans to prey on a teenage girl weren't coming into fruition. To start off this story, this happened while I was in college. My sophomore year, I lived in the dorms and I was assigned to a random roommate. He seemed a little bit introverted but fairly normal at first, but he wouldn't really talk to me. I would try to start conversations about things he showed interest in, but he would only give me one-word answers that were obviously meant to end the conversation. I figured he probably just didn't like me, so I decided I would give him some space and leave him alone. After a few days, that's when it started. I would notice that he was always staring in my direction. I chalked it up to coincidence, but it continued happening. Classes started up, and I spent less and less time in the room, but whenever I was in there, he would be constantly looking in my direction. Whenever I would turn to face him, he would turn his head away from me, but it would creep me out since it was pretty much constant. I started noticing that he would lay on his bed to read, but he would always hold the book or papers at an angle that always gave him a direct line of sight to me. About a week or so into the semester, my girlfriend at the time and I went on a morning hike and crashed on my bed at around 2 p.m. We woke up to him just standing there staring at us about 2 hours later. He didn't say anything, just turned and left the room. It was at that point that I decided I needed to leave before he did something to me in my sleep. I got out of there pretty quickly. Fortunately, I didn't see him again for quite a while, but we ended up having a class together senior year. I had been telling my friends that story ever since it happened, and they didn't believe me. One of my friends had really poor vision, so we sat in the front row. Of course, every time I looked behind me, my old roommate was always staring directly at me. Not at the teacher, but at me. It didn't really matter if we were on the middle or on one of the sides. I challenged my friends to look back a single time during the semester and catch him not looking at me. Within 5 classes, they gave up, and they agreed that he was staring at me non-stop, and that he was indeed super creepy. My parents think he was in love with me, but I just think he was crazy. I guess I'll never really know what his deal was. So this happened at the end of summer of 2016. To give a bit of backstory, my boyfriend and I were both around 20 years old. So my boyfriend Max and I used to share an apartment with another married couple. Mind you, they were pretty awesome people. Unfortunately for us, Florida wasn't what they wanted, so they decided to move to Pennsylvania. Max and I started looking for people to replace them with because of rent, and it was pretty pricey, and we didn't want to have to pay for the whole thing all on our own. It was in a very nice area, but not close enough to the city, so most people that told us they would drop by to check the place out would flake out last minute. Eventually, we found this person that seemed to be a very nice and laid-back girl. She then explained to us how she was looking for a place for her boyfriend, Dan. Now, I tend to see people's auras when I meet them, and I always get a certain feeling when I don't like them immediately. I'm not a judgmental person in the slightest, it's just something I feel and can't help. I did not like this person straight off the bat, but I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt because everyone else seemed to be okay with him, so I thought I might be wrong, and I was hoping I was. As the time went by, said Dan started being super loud. He would invite people over on weeknights till 4 a.m. He would play music loud enough for it to sound like it was being played from our room, and multiple other annoying things, and also being beyond disrespectful, especially to me. Max wouldn't do anything about it, and I'm kinda glad because I know Dan would have wanted to fight him or something. Dan was 22 at the time, but he had the mentality of a 12-year-old. Side note, we later found out that Dan had some previous mugshots for shoplifting and other stuff. He also threatened to beat me up several times. Yeah, me, a 20-year-old girl. I just wanted to give you a bit of insight on Dan so you understand what is coming up. Buckle up. It was a Wednesday night, and I got home at around 5:30. As I was walking upstairs and almost to the 3rd floor, which is where we lived, I saw him coming out of the apartment, but I don't say anything because we don't like him, so I just mostly ignored him. He then started yelling at me and telling me to look at the apartment. I looked inside from the doorway and I saw nothing wrong, so I asked what he was talking about, and still in an angry voice he claimed that he had been robbed and that he had also just gotten home to this. But I saw all the furniture is there and whatnot, so I didn't really know what he was going on about. I then went inside and I noticed that my Wii U was gone, but the rest of my consoles were there. So at this point, I was already getting pretty suspicious of him. I tried to keep calm as much as I could, and I called Max to see how far from home he was. We usually both got home around the same time. As I'm calling, Dan yelled at me again that he had called the cops and that they were on their way, and in these exact words he then said,
"Do whatever you need to do, because the police are on their way."
When he told me that, I immediately knew he had been home for a while because he must have had time to hide all of his weapons and drugs and God knows what else he had. Within about 5 minutes, the cops were pulling in, and so was Max. One officer went upstairs with Dan and Max to write down everything that was missing, and the other officer stayed downstairs. I stayed with him, just chatting. According to Max, we're missing a lot of our stuff in our room, but Dan is only missing his PS4. I did ask him at last if it was possible to search Dan's car, and I also said if he needed to search my or Max's car, we'd be okay with it. He said it wasn't necessary, but agreed to search Dan's car. Once they all came back downstairs, the officers asked Dan if they could search his car and that they also needed his ID. He said he was okay with them searching his car, but that he had to get his ID and keys from the apartment. Max and I followed him upstairs. We saw him get his wallet and keys and he left the apartment. We don't want to be nosy and stay downstairs while they search his car, so we decided to stay in the apartment. A few minutes go by and he's still not downstairs with the cops, so we started looking around the neighborhood, but he had already vanished. How convenient, but since he had agreed that they could search his car and in no moment said that they couldn't, they went ahead and started looking if the car was unlocked, and it was. We found all of our stuff in his car. In the car was our 3DS, our PS4 controller, Max's laptop, some Wii U games, and a lot more. The very next morning, I decided to put all of his stuff out by the dumpster and then had a locksmith change our locks. I thought of putting a restraining order on him, but we ended up never going through with it. A few weeks later, we saw his car parked outside a few yards from our building, but we pretended like we didn't see him and we just watched him from our room with 911 ready to be dialed. Eventually he just left and he didn't cause any more problems. But still, Dan, I really hope we don't encounter you ever again. So, about 3 years ago, I was going to a school in a US city, and I was living with 2 other roommates. One of my roommates was pretty well known to usually bring seedy characters back to the apartment. At one point during our fall semester, she befriended a guy in her advertising class who went by the name of Dallas. He became her weed dealer, and she would frequently bring him over to the apartment. I suspected they were sleeping together, but she always denied it. It was a strange relationship, but who am I to judge? My other roommate and I thought he was charismatic enough, but we also didn't see the appeal that Christy saw. I remember one night when we had Dallas over for dinner. He told us how he played for our college's football team and that he started his own business at the age of 25. He was a very well-known weed dealer who made a crap ton of money, and his name was Dallas because he used to live in Dallas, Texas, and apparently that's what his parents named him after. Me and my other roommate nodded our heads and listened, but we didn't think much of it except for this dude thought he was hot stuff and wanted to gloat about himself. Mind you, he was like 5'4" and probably not over 150 pounds. I believe he came over for dinner maybe about 2 more times after that. My roommate claimed that one time she decided to buy weed from him and went to his apartment off campus. When she arrived, she saw our roommate Christy just pass the crap out on a chair in the middle of the day in Dallas's apartment in some random room. When my roommate arrived, he mentioned nothing of her being there. My roommate shook her awake, and Christy just woke up in a haze and basically told my roommate to screw off. My roommate recounted the story to me, and we both agreed it was pretty freaking weird, and Dallas was probably not the safest person to hang with. After a couple of months, Christy stopped hanging out with him. I remember her saying he got pissed because she didn't want to sleep with him. I also found out that a friend of hers who knew him for a long time was engaged to him. Oh, and also, his real name wasn't Dallas. I mean, real shocker there. Fast forward 2 years. Neither me or my roommate talk to Christy anymore. We're living elsewhere in said city doing our own thing. We get an alert on our phones that a girl who had just transferred to our college went missing after leaving one of the campus bars the previous night. It doesn't take very long, maybe a few days, when this huge story breaks. Apparently, this girl was killed by someone she left the bar with that night. So I get a call from my roommate, and the call goes something like this. "Dude, do you remember what Dallas's real name was?" "Yeah, I believe it was something like Michael or something." She replies back with, "Go online and read this article. He freaking killed that girl who just went missing." Sure enough, I go online, and there is the most creepiest mugshot of Dallas, next to a photo of the girl he had just slain. Well, it gets crazier. Apparently he had taken her home that night. I'm assuming it was a one-night stand sort of thing. So I guess at one point things turned bad and he killed her by blunt force and strangulation. And if that isn't terrible enough for you, he cleaned up the evidence in his apartment, threw her body in a storage container, and took a freaking lift to his grandma's house hours away. And then he buried the storage container with her remains in it on the property somewhere. After obtaining a video of the 2 of them leaving the bar together, it didn't take the cops very long to find him. Weeks after that story broke, so many different girls came forward and shared similar creepy stories about Dallas, the guy who played college football and ran a successful business. You can guess that none of this was ever true. Also, he was like 28 years old, claiming he was still a student at our college when this all happened, when in reality he was probably just there prying on younger women. It's truly a horrible story what happened to that young girl. Without going into too much detail, my first year in college I stayed in a suite-style room. 2 of us in one room and 2 in the other, and we shared a bathroom outside of our doors. Long story short, by the end of the year, the suite mates and I became great friends, and we alienated my roommate of the group. She ended up being a really hateful person. We decided that our second year we would try to get rooms together. We ended up only getting 2 of us in the same room, and the third person had a single. My roommate Cora was my roommate before. Now, Cora smoked a lot of weed. She couldn't go to any class without getting absolutely stoned. Now, I didn't have a problem with this, but I didn't smoke. Now, my roommate Sarah also smoked, but very little. Again, the first few weeks of our second year were great, and we had a lot of fun, and we all got along really well. That is, until Cora flipped a switch and changed completely. The first red light was when I asked her if she could cover herself when she got out of the shower. She would shower and stay completely naked and walk around the room, and I explained to her how it made me uncomfortable. She was fine with it. I didn't care if she wore a towel, but just not butt naked in the middle of the day in our tiny room. Next came the weird instances. Sarah came over quite often and slept on the floor between us, and we had a lot of laughs throughout the night. But there was one night when Sarah was awoken by someone reaching over to her very close, too close, and they were brushing her chest. She just froze and pretended she was asleep. She opened her eyes a little while later, and Cora was staring at her in the complete darkness. No phone, just staring wide awake. From here on, things just went crazy. She would scream at the top of her lungs in the shower and after because she couldn't walk around naked. She began to pluck every single pubic hair while laying in bed under her blankets, making herself bleed. She also started punching things repeatedly, and overall she made the environment extremely hostile. After a few weeks of this, I decided to spend most of my time in the study room down the hall that was only big enough for one person. Cora and Sarah were in the room, and I see Sarah run frantically down to the study room door and ask if she can come in. I waved her in, and she was in a state of complete panic. While I was in the study room, Cora had a complete breakdown. She threatened to hurt me and how she was waiting until I got back so she could strangle me. She was throwing things around the room and speaking horrible things about me and my family. Things that were so bad that Sarah wouldn't repeat them to me. She got to the point saying that she would hurt me in my sleep and strangle me while I'm studying. It was so bad that Sarah was frozen in fear. As soon as Cora left the room and decided to go eat, that's when Sarah ran to me and told me everything. Apparently, it got to the point that she actually had a pocket knife in her hand and was pacing back and forth waiting for my return. I ended up having to switch rooms, go to a safe room, and completely change my situation because she wanted to hurt me. Sarah and I are still great friends after we both transferred at the end of that year. She decided to see her about a month after I left the room, and Cora had carved the word happy into her arm and scarred herself on her upper shoulder. She repeatedly badmouthed the situation like we planned on ruining her life, when in reality it was all her. She's the one who went crazy. I really don't know what happened to her. There's a few more details that I left out, but overall this person became a complete nightmare almost overnight. Be sure to really get to know the person before you become roommates with them. You never really know who they'll turn out to be. Be careful. The story happened to me years ago, but it still affects me to this day. The summer after I graduated high school, I was still living at home with my family. I was up one late night and was packing for a camping trip with my friends. It was unbelievably hot, and I had the window open as I sat and folded my clothes. It was around 2 in the morning, and the next thing I knew, there was a hand coming through the gap in the screen of my window. I screamed, and the hand flew back out. I was stunned, but there was a part of me that wondered if it was my younger brother pranking me. I got up and looked out the window and just saw a figure of a man. He was staring at me. I ran into my brother's room, and he was there playing video games. We called the police, who came and searched the area. They didn't find anything, and they warned me and my parents to lock all of the windows and doors, and then they left. We were all still shaken up, and my mom had a feeling that he would come back. It turns out her mother's intuition was right. She went outside and waited on our back porch. After about 20 minutes or so, she saw the man dressed in black slink into our backyard along the tree line. He hid behind a tree for a few seconds and ran to another tree and hid there, slowly working his way toward my window. My mother yelled something to him and he took off running. The police came back out again, but they found no trace of him. I never opened that window ever again, not even the curtains. My parents had installed some motion detecting lights, and that seemed to be the end of that. About 6 months later, my friend and I got an apartment downtown together. We were really excited as this was our first place all on our own. The apartment wasn't exactly the best quality, but it was so fun to be living in the city, and again, all on our own. The downside was that it was street parking only. After a few weeks, my car was broken into. Nothing was taken but a single rose sat on the passenger seat. It was pretty creepy, but I vowed to be vigilant and safe. I always tried to park close to the entrance near the lights, but often it was difficult to get those spots, and I would often have to park further away on darker streets. Things quickly began escalating at this point. My car was broken into at least once a week. Most of the time a flower was left, which I always threw on the ground, but once there was a pair of men's underwear left. And even more creepily, once a bag of Tootsie Rolls, as they were my favorite candy. This made me wonder if the person doing this knew me personally, and I started to become really suspicious and paranoid of everyone. There was a laundry area in the basement of the apartment, and one day I went down to get a load that finished drying. As I started to fold them, I realized all of my undergarments, bras, and panties were gone. I mean, they were completely just gone. Another week I had a male friend over from school and his tire got slashed during the visit. By the time the first letter arrived, I had already started making plans to move elsewhere. The letter described a love for me that had been going on for years. He began to note things that proved he had been watching me very closely. I was able to arrange for another friend to take over my lease, and I moved in with another friend on the other side of the city. It was a secured building and had an underground parking garage that was only accessible to tenants. I felt much more secure, and the extra money spent was well worth the peace of mind. Things were quiet for a few months, and then my roommate got a boyfriend. Most of us were wary of Ashley's new boyfriend from the beginning. For one, they met on MySpace after he reached out to her. Another reason was that the new boyfriend, Matt, was extremely good looking. And while Ashley was a wonderful person, she just wasn't the type you would typically expect to date someone like him. Ashley was thrilled. She had never had a boyfriend and had really felt like he was her Prince Charming. I thought he was weird and creepy from the beginning. Matt was on the quiet side, and he always seemed to be sporting an uncomfortable, leering smile. It was difficult to carry on any sort of conversation with him because he would always make it weird with some kind of random fact that was completely unrelated to what we were talking about. I had deleted my MySpace when the initial stalking began, but I created a dummy account to learn more about Matt. It didn't look like he really knew any of his friends in real life. There were only pictures of himself, and the rest of the information was vague. My friends and I gently tried to discourage her from dating Matt. He technically hadn't done anything wrong, but he was just strange. She would immediately get defensive and would shut the conversation down immediately. Matt started to spend more time at the apartment, and I found myself finding any excuse I could to avoid coming home. One day I came home from work and I found Matt on my couch alone drinking a beer. Ashley had been called into work, and she told him he could just hang out until she got home. I was furious because I didn't want to spend any time with him, so I grabbed a beer and a snack and headed off to my room and shut the door. After about 30 minutes or so, he knocked on my door and suggested we watch some TV and get to know each other better because we both loved Ashley. I didn't want to, but decided that maybe I needed to give it a try. Give him the benefit of the doubt, if you will. He put on a movie and I tried to just focus on the movie because I didn't want to talk. At one point I glanced over to Matt and he was just staring at me with a smile on his face. I snapped a, "What? What are you looking at?" at him, and he just continued smiling and said,
I don't know. I just can't believe it.
"You can't believe what?" I asked. He then said nothing and went back to watching the movie, still smiling. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the interaction had every hair standing up on my body. I then excused myself and then locked the door to my room. Another month or so went on, and I had managed to avoid being home for anything other than sleep and showering. Matt practically lived there now, and he had even brought a bunch of his things into Ashley's room. I really didn't want to move again, but I was beginning to look for other options. On their 6-month anniversary, I saw a huge bouquet of flowers on the table, and an already open card propped right next to it. I rolled my eyes and was about to leave when I decided to see what the weirdo wrote to her. When I opened the card, my heart started beating through my chest. Without even reading the words he wrote, I was shaking. The handwriting was exactly the same as the one my stalker had sent. I had kept them as evidence and dug them out of my desk for comparison. The handwriting was unique and identical. Matt was indeed the stalker. I called the police first. As they were on the way, I called Ashley and I asked her to come over immediately. She said she was at work but said she would be there when she could. I was really freaked out to tell her because I knew she would be shattered. The police took a statement from me and actually went to Ashley's work to get more information from her, and they ended up breaking the news. Apparently, Ashley called Matt and left a furious message, even though the cops told her not to say anything, and he completely disappeared after that. There was no Matt or anyone matching his resemblance at the place he said he worked. Ashley had never been to his apartment because he said he had been staying with friends while trying to save money for a trip to Europe. His family lived out of state and she had never even met any of his friends. He said they had a falling out because he was choosing to spend so much time with Ashley. In the end, it was all lies. She was dating a stranger. We honestly don't even know if Matt was his real name. The cherry on top of this whole thing was when we went through Matt's things. He had left all of his things when he disappeared, and Ashley and I decided to go through all of his stuff. There was a duffel bag that was full of gym clothes, but in one of the compartments there was about 10 pictures of me. All of them were taken far away with the exception of one of me sleeping. The sheets were current, so I know it had to have been at the current apartment before I started locking my bedroom door. A few of the pictures dated back to before the incident at my parents' house, which made us think that that was him as well. 2 pairs of my missing underwear were there, and I shuddered to think of what he did with the rest. A Starbucks lid with my red lipstick marks, a necklace I hadn't even noticed missing, a few other random sick souvenirs. It was so creepy. Unfortunately, the police were never able to track him down. I decided to accept an opportunity overseas that I'd been considering, and I got the heck out of there as soon as I could. Unfortunately, Ashley and I quickly drifted apart. She had a really hard time accepting that her first love was a complete psycho. I think I had some underlying anger for believing all of his lies and letting him into our lives. I didn't know what his end game was. Would he have tried to hurt me, or was he just simply content with being involved in my world? I guess I'll never know. Being stalked changes you. Even when I lived across the world, I looked over my shoulder everywhere I went. To this day, I still have no social media accounts attached to my real name. If I had to guess, he's probably messing with some new woman now. But every time I visit my hometown, I am tense to keep a low profile. Part of me will always worry that Matt will resurface again, but I really hope that never happens. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's video. And if you have your own personal scary story, be sure to submit that to my subreddit at reddit.com/r/southerncannibal or to my email at southerncannibal@gmail.com. I'm always looking for new stories. And before we bring this video to a close, I just want to shout out all of my $5 or more patrons, as well as my $3 or more patrons featured on screen. Shout out to Babe Lincoln, Beth A, Kate E, Celeste S, Ellie S, Emily W, Heather B, Howard R, Jacqueline W, Jazzy G, Jonathan C, Lori J, Matthew B, Michael G, Random Randy, Steph L, Tammy S, and Terry H. Thank all of you so much for supporting me on Patreon. I really appreciate it more than you know. And if any of you would like to join these awesome people and also become a patron, head over to my Patreon at patreon.com/southerncannibal. Thank you everyone, and have a good one. And remember to always stay